Yes, I want to acknowledge the Aboriginal people here from this country, and at the same time I want to acknowledge all the Melangimbi people that I've worked with for a long time. And just to explain, in terms of Gurutu, I call Dr. Gumbula Due. So for those of you who have some inkling of what that means, I'll pass that information on. This paper explores the methodology and the aspirations of Dr. Gumbula and his work forming relationships with all the institutions within the GLAM sector. He achieved much in his life, but it is work in museums and archives that this paper wishes to address and applaud. It draws extensively on work undertaken with him in 2010 in museums in the United States. All held collections from Melangimbi, hence the driving force for going to them. He was focused on finding cultural material from his own Gupapuyngu clan, but he also looked more broadly at material from Eastern Arnhem Land. There was engagement with museum staff that provided a wealth of information, not only about the objects, but about his culture to the museums. This paper draws on a much longer paper I've written, and it also draws theoretically on the concepts of new museology, with its emphasis on museums as contact zones. These ideas come from non-museum practitioners, Mary Louise Pratt and James Clifford. Robin Boast has brought to our attention that it is often not mentioned in other writings about the new museology, and that's Pratt's original use of transculturation and autoethnography. These ideas, particularly of autoethnography, relate to the work of Dr. Gumbula. He took the information he gained and he produced his own interpretation of events and objects, and I think that film is a classic example of that. Gumbula's career in the museum world started around 2000 when he came to Museum Victoria to work with Lindy Allen in search of Gupapuyngu material. A successive chain of experiences followed. He worked both in museums, like you can see here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales with Cara Penchbeck, but he worked just as much outside of museums and in his community, as you see here in Melangimbi. These are the places that we visited in 2010 in America. One striking feature of Gumbula's methodology was his unhurried approach to analysis. His deliberate slowness was sometimes met by frustration by those in the museum. His deep thinking and desire to give the appropriate response was an essential part of his methodology that was captured on film and in video. His actual work in museum storerooms revolved around a complex process in which the importance of kinship, naming, and physical interactions with objects led to his bigger exegesis not only of the objects but the cultural world in which people and objects come together. Kinship formed the frame in which he worked. He was always careful to introduce himself with his name and his clan affiliation. He wanted to know about the collector Lloyd Warner and his family. I made arrangements with Warner's children for Dr. Gumbula to meet. Warner's son William lives in Berkeley, California, and these two men really enjoyed getting together and talking about things they had in common. Both of Lloyd Warner's daughters live in New York City, so we went to New York City with one purpose, to talk with them. We met with Anne Warner Ireland and Carolyn Hightower in Central Park and in their respective homes. He brought them copies of his catalogue from Makar Gama, held at the Macleay Museum in Sydney. Back in the museum, Dr. Gumbula introduced staff to the concept that objects fit into the kinship system as well as people. This was something that some people weren't quite really ready to grasp. He casually pointed to an object on the table at the Phoebe hearse and said, "That's my mother." It was a kut-kut, a feathered head pin. Dr. Gumbula's mother was Eva Maringen, a Gupapuyngu woman. The headdress he pointed to was a dua moiety one belonging to the Gupapuyngu clan, providing the basis for Gumbula's relationship to the object through his mother. The implication of what Dr. Gumbula was telling me and others was profound. Later we were looking at a ceremonial object that belonged to the Yolngu clan, and this is what he had to say.
Like my cousins, auntie, grandfather, you know, if I, for instance, like if I call my mother's grandmother, particular the photos you have with Donald Thompson, one Burma, that's my Mary over there. What she have all the copyright of her own through things like this. I call Mary, the person and the objects, and I am relation to them as a gutara. See, this is how it works. Sort of, it underline all the family within me and all the totem with me. We're still
in that same kinship pattern.
Kinship, through kinship, through bloodline.
We were then looking at other Warner Melangimbi ceremonial objects that belonged to the Melanjingi clan. And looking at one object, Dr. Gumbula said, "This would be my son, my gato." He then went on to explain about Berenula being the rightful owner of the land and the object. So I asked him, what relationship did Berenula have to those objects?
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Hereditary owner. Hereditary
Okay.
ownership of the, you know, of the land. No more. He's Ranga. He's Marayan.
He's fantastic.
He will be the leader of the show. He will be the chief.
Be the chief. So it's like he's the object.
Yeah. Not ours. No. We are only related to Guruto, to that object, which is Gato. So I will call Brunyala as a Gato and the as a Gato.
Yeah. For Dr. Gumbula, a key element to his research with collections was the appropriate naming of everything. The first item he looked at was an axe. He gave us his preferred name for the axe, Gapamata, but he also told the curator there how the axe was used, the materials it was constructed with, and a wealth of other material. Weapons, sometimes weapons, such as spear throwers and spears, provided a greater number of objects to work with. One division he made relates back to kinship of objects. In some cases, he grouped objects by their moiety, dua or yiricha. When possible, he would do clan groups. Spears, or gara, are a great example of his method of analysis. All of the spears at the Peabody were placed on one long table. He went about making his own selections, and he made different groupings of the spears by the categories that he defined, such as Bati, Nambi, Demenji, and so forth. So before explaining the smaller groups, he explained his methodology to be one of the Baparu of spears, and you heard a little bit of that. I am now going to be looking at spears, Baparu of spears. What is going to tell me through my knowledge, if I understand these, is gara or spears. I am not going through the numbers. I am going through the families of the spears and try to name them. What were they? What were their names? Their names are important to the community. They will have specific names. What the tree was, what the nuru was, you've got to name that. That is very important. At the moment, I am not going through the numbers that the collector has put there, but I'm going through the history of the Boparoo of those particular changes of spears. And I must say that he wasn't impressed with collection managers arranging his arrangement by numbers. They quickly stopped doing that. With the spears, Dr. Gumbula also had an unorthodox approach to analysing the materials used in the spears. And I'm sorry for all collection managers here. To determine the type of wood, he would sharply tap the spears, and different sounds from the wood to him meant, of course, the different kind of wood.
There's no difference, see that you want to win.
In some discussions, the making of an object and how it was used were the prime focus, not just a word or a category for a database. These conversations revealed highly relevant information about the object linked to its relationship to land and people. And I'd like to return to the kut-kut that we looked at earlier.
But this is only a wooden one.
Okay, good. I was like, it looks wood, but
But mainly, if they seriously want to, organize themselves, they would have gone with the stingray and put it on and things like this. But this is my mother people. That's how they do it, because they are sharp people.
Would that be Gupapuyngu?
Like Gupapuyngu, like my mother is a sharp people. But that they can actually do that, And this is kut-kut. You picked up by milling it, but I'm just saying the main sort of what the people's performance, how they do, compared to the names of kut-kut. And this is the kut-kut that actually put it over here, trapping up. But the spine, the very spine, it's got a sort of, it can grab something.
well, that's what I was wondering too. Yeah.
And when they dance as a sort of a sharp dance, a really sharp dance, so it's long full one while they dance, so they stick it onto the spine to make it harder, and the ceremony is finished and they take it off.
At the Phoebe Hearst, we examined these two boomerangs from Warner. After naming them Gali Gali, he explained, let me just get this back up, explained how they were actually used as clapping sticks. The unexpected turn of the conversation had to do with the nature of the two boomerangs. Gumbula explained that there's a smooth side, a hitting side, a flat surface. For the clapping of the Gali Gali, the size does not matter, but you need two different boomerangs. He said, according to my understanding, you need to have a left and a right, like a shoe. There was no right at the Phoebe Hearst. He astutely pointed out, if Warner collected these two, there is a missing one from the set. There is one somewhere, perhaps at the Peabody. Well, I went searching to find the right shoe. This is the boomerang from the Peabody. They have one. That's the front and the back. Definitely not a match. However, the National Museum of Australia has 6 known boomerangs from Warner, and these are the 6 in the NMA. One of them is most likely a match, the missing right one to make the pair. Have I found Dr. Gumbula's right shoe in the boomerang from the National Museum in Canberra? Dr. Gumbula's exploration of the Gali Gali is symptomatic of the nature of collecting, museum practices, and what could happen in the future. Collections are made and often dispersed. Often in this process, there's been a lack of in-depth knowledge about objects which could have made a big difference in the way the items were placed together, or in this case, broken up. Gumbula's aspiration to find the right shoe is a quest, not just for this boomerang, but expresses a desire for museums and collectors to be more inclusive. Indigenous people need to be permitted to use all of their senses, visual, haptic, and oral, and in some cases, they need this in order to understand the objects in the collection. Gumbula actually wanted to play the two gully-gully at the Phoebe Hearst, but the shock on the face of the collection manager was enough to stop him from doing so. Could the two gully-gully come together in the future, and could they clap? There were many examples of the way in which Dr. Gumbula brought concepts into his examination of objects. I deal with others in the paper, but I want to talk briefly about spears, like this one, which is a stone-headed spear from Warner.
Peacekeeping ceremony. People call peacekeeping ceremony is not actually the peacekeeping ceremony. There was a penalty should be sorted out. A penalty should be sorted out and witnessed by each clan members, each clan group from different areas in Northeast Ireland. Every clan had to witness the problems being dealt in a good sort of peace and harmony. And that was all about. So peacekeeping ceremony, this is where this word comes from, peacekeeping ceremony. It was sort of like people going to jail or some sort of, stealing or whatever. What crime do people make during this? This was a form like the performance that they done in Makarata was a sort of, it's like a court case. It's like a court case, but this has been dealt with the spear. So someone who has been sort of breaking the law in the community had to have his, that's the penalty. You have penalties until the penalty, like a spear going through someone's leg.
One of these.
Well, not these, I'm just telling about it, and just a normal sort of seeing what's happening. What is Makarata? Makarata is the peacekeeping ceremony. I'm just talking to the major sort of thing that was happening. And the Makarata wasn't happening sort of every, it's not a festival.
On reflection, Dr. Gumbula Makarata explanation, which he gave in 2010, was a precursor to the major event held in August 2016 at Melingimbi, Makarata Bringing the Past into the Future. That event was one in which institutional representatives who held collections from Melingimbi came together with Yolngu to come to an understanding about the management and care of those collections. Unfortunately, he did not live long enough to see the event or to place his signature on the Melingimbi Makarata resolution. You saw a film earlier from Pip Devison, and this film, particularly the last 10 minutes, is an example of what I believe is Gumbula's own autoethnography in a visual format rather than a textual one. He gave instructions to us that this film was also to be presented to Yolngu. And then, in conclusion, one concern of Gumbula was that proper procedures should be followed when doing research. According to him, these procedures were not always followed in the past, especially the recording of appropriate names of objects and people. He was concerned how Aboriginal people would have access in the archival information and the objects themselves in the museums in the future, particularly for his own grandchildren. Museums may not always be the only place for information to be held in the future. His film was a good example of transculturation. In the last section, his message to Yolngu, he explains how the elders did not give much information to the collectors in the past, and what was given was not always recorded correctly. His advice for young Yolngu, and I think for other researchers as well, is to do the documentation according to their own law and the right way. In conclusion, I would agree with both that museums have been seen in the past as the authority and expert on all items held in their collections. The new museology has brought about many changes to museum practice, including a desire to work more collaboratively with new stakeholders. To see the museum of the future adding a more enriching role, all parties need to combine their energies and work. This process can be more efficient if all researchers, including Indigenous and non-Indigenous, are willing to participate. Gumbula's trip to the United States was an example of how Aboriginal people can work effectively with researchers and museum staff to mutually benefit each other. His own multisensory approach, combined with his Indigenous knowledge base, presented a unique understanding of the museum's collections in America. I can only aspire to continue searching for the right foot in all of its variations for my Due, Dr. Gumbula. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. That was fabulous. And thank you, Dr. Gumbula. It's just so great to hear him talking, and those messages that he shared with all of us were invaluable and repeated, reinforced to us all the time in working with him. So before I start, I too would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of this land. I would also like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. The University of Sydney is built on their land, and their land was their university. Importantly, of course, I want to acknowledge the Yolngu people in the audience, whose cultural heritage I have the privilege to work with, and especially members of Gumbula's family. It's really special to have you here, and it was a privilege and an honour to work with Dr. Gumbula. You shared him with us a lot in our workplaces, and we'll be forever grateful for that. So my name's Rebecca Conway. I'm Curator of Ethnography at the University of Sydney Macleay Museum. I'm not a huge fan of the title, Curator Ethnography. It sounds a lot more scientific than sort of what I feel I do, which is mostly talking to people about collections. Apologies from Matt Pohl, my colleague, Indigenous curator, and also the university's repatriation program manager. He couldn't be here because he's speaking at another event. So this day is dedicated to Yolngu Elder and academic Dr. Joe Gumbula, and our panel's subject is community engagement. And he really expressed that, that sort of relationship in everything he did. I'd like to acknowledge that really pretty much everything I've learned about Yolngu collections and philosophies is through his teaching. And really what he was always stressing to us was the importance, the value of working and engaging with the community with those collections. So what I wanted to share with you today are some of the insights, the core insights that he gave to me in working alongside him on those collections, and also how I'm trying to take his messages that he gave to me forward in a recent research trip and a recent project that we're working on, or a current project we're working on with the university museums, involving the development of a new exhibition to go into our new museum that'll be opening at the end of 2019. And so literally a couple of weeks ago we were in Milingimbi, Ramingining and Yirrkala talking to people about the collections that we hold, and talking to people about how we can incorporate Yolngu design principles and philosophies into the exhibition. So it's not me doing the exhibition, but I can help facilitate, just like I worked with Gumbula on his show at the Macleay. So I initially met Gumbula when he started working at the university, in the university archives, working with historic photographs from his region. The other thing I wanted to do was just share a quote with you, I guess, which sort of really resonated with me around the way in which collections relate to people. And this is from an Indigenous Canadian artist and curator, David Garneau. He said, "Indigenous curation is a curation of people rather than things. From Latin, curator is linked not just to object care, but to healing, curing. Rather than cure objects in the sense of preserving them, Indigenised curators heal the estrangement between people and their belongings. They restore and restore." And that's what Gumbula was always doing in his work, and what we want to support going forward in our museums, I think. So really, yes, objects are so much more than, or objects are people, really. They're living things, and they're family. And we've seen that illustrated through Louise's talk, through this presentation here of Gumbula. All these objects represent him. And I really see that our roles in museums is to not ourselves curate these collections, but our main role is to facilitate the sharing and the access to them, and the Indigenous interpretation through Indigenous curators. Sorry, I'm a bit lost. The other thing I wanted to share was a quote from Gumbula himself about how we should work together. I recorded the following quote with him when he was talking about his work with museums. "It's a collaboration with the past, with the elders who talked and who made things in the past, and with those Ballanda, the foreigners, who brought these things to archives and museums. It is a collaboration with the present." And he thanked his community, all the clans, the Dua and the Yirritja. And he also thanked the museum and different people that he worked with in universities and other institutions. And he said, "I hope that we can all continue to work together and to take this message forward for our young people. It is a collaboration for the future." And one thing that you see repeated through his work all the time is this future-forward attitude about what needs to happen and how we need to work together into the future. So sorry, back to these collections. So these are some of the earliest collections at the University of Sydney that relate to Yolngu people. The large proportion of the holding is in the university archives and includes images taken during the development of the Milingimi mission. And there are also photos from Lloyd Warner, who was an early anthropologist within the Department of Anthropology at Sydney University. And these were brought together, some of them by A.P. Elkin, but others ended up being used as teaching materials in the Department of Anthropology in order to educate people about the fieldwork and the work that anthropologists were doing, and the ways in which they were thinking about Yolngu people. So we heard Joe say before, you know, anthropologists, they didn't always get it right. And so one of the core jobs that tasks that he set himself was getting the information right, getting the right Yolngu information, connecting them up to people. And that, of course, was often a very personal experience, because within these archives he was finding photos of his actual immediate family, as well as members of his broader family and clans. And so the photo on the right-hand side, the second on the right, the man with a jaunty pipe, is Jawa, and he's here with some other men who Gumbula named. And it was really like an important thing for Joe to talk about people working together to build the mission as well. The mission time was a source of great pride, that sort of the productivity of that period. So, importance of naming. That was a really, really big thing. We heard people from Malka talking about that the other day as well. Names, once they're there, connect the objects back to the right people. The right people then have the authority to talk about them, and young people coming behind will learn something from that naming program. So it wasn't just Joe either, so he was always referring back and consulting with his own community about these identifications. It was a group effort through the mechanism of Gumbula. So the first time that Joe came up to the museum to have tea with us and to meet and say hello, he walked up with his brother George, and at the very end of the gallery on display, just by chance, we didn't organise it, was this painting on the left. And he just sort of gets to the top of the stairs and he goes, "Oh, that's my painting." And I was like, "What?" And he said, "Yep, that's my father's painting. I know that painting." And of course, it's a painting by Jawa. It's Waterpan, it's the emu. And he had, you know, whether it was exactly this painting, but he had sat at his father's side as he painted this and told him the story about what's happening in here. The Macleay doesn't have an incredibly large collection from Milingimbi, but it does have some very significant items, and they include some items from the Lloyd Warner collections that were made in the 1920s alongside those photographs, and on the right is an object that Joe was very interested in, and we had a big sort of reveal of with anxious collection managers and curators who were like, "Oh, don't do that, don't touch this," you know. We rolled it out and he examined it incredibly closely. This is a Gororo, which he named. It's a pandana sail for a lipa lipa, a dugout canoe. So it was quite early on that Gumbula decided that one of the products of his ARC grant could be an exhibition. So he was very excited by the objects and the photographs that he was working with. But the Macleay Museum has a very, very large collection of natural history. That's sort of one of the legacy collections of the Macleay family. And so the exhibition grew to include an incredibly, incredibly large number of taxidermied specimens, mostly birds. And as he explained, you know, these are our daily partners. These are our family as well. These are all these things. They're Dura and Yiricha. We've got names for all of them, and they need to be in this show as well. They're Yolngu collection. So he really expanded that concept of what a Yolngu collection is or should be. And we spent hours trying to locate particular birds through the Yolngu description or through the sounds of the birds. And we ran around a lot with stuffed, quite smelly birds. But perching up the top on the left-hand side was quite an important bird. And somebody can correct me if I've got the pronunciation wrong. Gurujutu? The kite. Gurujutu. So the kite he positioned at this high vantage point in the show, because it was, you know, it was his bird, and he wanted this bird to look down onto the exhibition and be a witness. So a lot of the objects, there was a real agency in how he arranged the objects in the show, the different relationships between things, or the positioning of things from one side of the exhibition to the other. So how he decided to structure the exhibition, which he titled Makagama, which is sort of a reference to that, the concept of the Makarata, but also this idea of an open ceremony. So this was going to be an archetypal ceremony of Yolngu, and in the exhibition he charted this sort of typical or classic Yolngu day from the sunrise to the sunset, and all the activities that happened across that sort of arc of the day were described, and the different animals and activities in terms of producing artworks or painting bodies, getting ready for ceremony were there. He also, one of the interesting things for me is that he then, taking that concept and giving it a sort of, because he was a musician and a performer as well, he really sort of had a performative aspect to the exhibition. So we had to employ an opera set painter to spray paint these sort of sunsets on the wall and sunrise, and it was quite fun. He also, basically, he combined a lot of things that maybe people wouldn't think of combining unless they're Yolngu. So, for example, one example would be he had Jawa's emu painting, an actual stuffed emu, the emu eggs, and the other aspect of the show, the performative side, was that there was a Manakay soundtrack which had these different Manakay about, for example, the waterpan or the nyerek, the white cockatoo, other really important animals that are telling people who they are. And that's one of the things that he really stressed, you know, everything is telling us who we are. I was just going to say one more thing. So in order to produce the text for the exhibition, without me trying to write down and, you know, dilute in any way the messages that he wanted to give, we spent hours recording, much like Louise did in various museums around the world, recording information about each of the objects, the stories that he wanted to tell, and also basically any interrelationship he wanted to talk about, he did, and these were produced into a catalogue. So yes, they were, you know, they've been translated into a written, printed form, but basically the text was from his oral testimony.
You just said you were going to say one more thing. So
Oh, it's about the text.
Oh, no. Sorry. I just took that as a cue. So I'll just sit down.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
I may go over because I'm just sort of rambling.
No, that's all right. Just, we're all friends.
Okay, so that was Gumbula's work and main messages 2009 to 2010 that show was on.
When it got shown across at the Seymour Centre too, didn't it go
So the other thing I should have mentioned, so this image that he chose to enlarge to this human and actually just slightly larger than human scale, this powerful image of men at a Makarrata ceremony at Milingimbi in 1927. And it was this image that went over to the Seymour Centre, which is on the other side of the campus, and it's a theatre and show venue. There was a small display of the show in conjunction with performances by the Chuki dancers. Yeah. So taking those sort of learnings from Gumbula in that exhibition, we're now looking at producing a new exhibition for the opening of what will be a new museum at the Sydney University, combining 3 of our museums into one new space, whiz-bang space. Museum management are very taken with, and perhaps through, I think, the work of Gumbula, the idea of having a Yolngu show, and we have some really significant generations of collections that have ended up at the university over time. So basically what we wanted to do with this recent trip, Matt, Paul and I, was to visit each of the communities where we hold collections and to just sort of remind people or let people know that the material is there, to try and start those relationships that revolve around getting the right information, have we got the right information, and then also extending that hopefully into talks about how we put the exhibition together, how we incorporate Yolngu design principles into the show, and also the incorporation of different generations of material from 3 different areas, or almost 2 different sides of Arnhem Land. So Milingimbi, Ramingining and Yirrkala. So I'm going to talk first about Ramingining. Now, look, there's this sort of idea that, or the one sort of striking thing to me about each of the art centres was that they are very different. but I think also they're not remote. People have this idea of the remote, you know, communities out there, but each of the art centres is very connected and very internationally focused. I mean, people at Milingimbi were just about to head off to Washington for a big show there. They're producing work for Coskeller and other design centres in Sydney and in Melbourne. Sorry. I mean, Mulka is dramatically connected to people through their multimedia programs and their very high-profiled artists. And Ramingining has this we were there for 4 days and they had 2 huge truckloads of tourists coming through. So there's this constant busyness around the art centres and movement. So sort of there's this sort of idea sometimes in museum management, I mean way above me, that people are just sort of sitting around waiting for us to come and consult with them, and they will have all this leisure time to focus on, you know, doing this kind of work, which is not true. So you sort of have to, you know, you have to front up, you have to say who you are, and you have to, yeah, start with a relationship first rather than trying to, you know, you try, of course, to meet these aspirations of the senior management about you're going to talk to everybody about every single painting, but it's not how it works. So the important thing is to sort of develop a relationship. The Ramingining collection is probably one of the more recent or the youngest collections, and it sits actually within the art gallery collection at the university. And it was a collection that was put together by John Mundine when he was the art centre manager there for about 10 years. Ramingining collection is a bit of a misnomer because, in fact, people from Milingimbi and Ramingining are constantly moving between those 2 sites, and a lot of the work is referencing Milingimbi clans and relationships to country. So John Mundine joined us for that Ramingining sector of the trip. And it's here, you know, there's already an established relationship. John worked with people there for 10 years, and people really flocked to the art centre to see him and to reconnect, and children chased us around town, you know, as we had our sort of evening stroll and things like that. Possibly because the collections are more recent. People had a different kind of engagement with the material, I think. But one of the core things, and this of course relates back to the messages of Gumbula, is that it's not just about art, it's not just paintings as art, as pretty things you can put on the wall. Yes, you can do that with them. You know, buy art for that reason by all means, because it supports the artists and the communities that flow on affect the economics throughout the community. So of course, talking to, on the right-hand side, Charlie Giorgini, who was a young man who has one work in that collection, he was like, well, you have to come out to my country. And so that's what we did. We didn't stay in the art centre. We went out and we looked at the sites that he was talking about, his clan relationships that he was expressing in the paintings in relation to country. Again, in Milingimbi, there was a relationship. So from the trip the previous year, which was centred on the Makarrata at Milingimbi, an event which Louise spoke about briefly, but was really like a vision of Gumbula to, rather than it always be him going out, let these museum people, let them front up here and meet us on our country, and let's talk about, let's have this ceremony, this sort of acknowledges that not everything that happened in the past was great. Let's you know, make peace over that and work out how we're going to work together into the future. And there was an arrangement of Larrakitch poles on the ceremonial ground, and it was through these poles and around these poles that the event took place. One of the sort of emotional things for me, because I'd never been to Milingimbi in all that time I worked with Gumbula, was to see the Gurujuju, the kites, reeling around above the Larrakitch was a great feeling. And the poles have become the latest acquisition in acknowledgement of Gumbula's role in teaching us about Yolngu collections and also honouring our relationship with that community. So they will form a centrepiece of the new exhibition that we're planning for 2019. So here we are with Raymond Bullambula and Joyce Nalibu, who were just about to head off to Washington. This is a view from the Art Centre. A lot of action happening outside the Art Centre in terms of weaving and dyeing of materials. Some of the earliest artefact or art collections at the university are from Yirrkala, and they're a really important series of bark paintings that were made in the 1940s when the anthropologist Ronald Berndt and his partner Catherine Berndt were living and working in Yirrkala for 2 years. Many of the artists that were involved in the production of this art were senior men, really senior men. They were the big men, the elders of that community. And many of them went on, they were the painters of the Yirrkala bark petition, and they really were using their art as to make statements, as it does, about their identity and about their rights based on their clan and other aspects of their lineage. So, look, through the collections that have been built up at the university, one aspect of what these collections are mapping is Yolngu's agency in relationships to Ballanda over time. So, you know, Gumbula talked about, oh, they didn't give some information. You know, people chose what they wanted to give often, and they chose to share certain types of information based on their judgments of the people that were there talking to them. And you can see that reflected in the documentary records that we've inherited often. You think, why isn't there any information here? Well, maybe the person wasn't trusted to have that information. They can have the artwork, they can buy that, but you can't have all the information associated with it. Anyway, today we tend to, you know, Gumbula is saying we want that information, we need that information for our young people. But there is a long history of Yolngu sharing information around collections. So this is an example of some early interaction with our collections at the Macleay Museum. In the 1970s, Wanjak Marika came and examined these paintings from Yirrkala. And this was at a time before we had access to information which was held in Ronald Berndt's field notes and diary entries. And basically, yes, he came, much like Gumbula, and looked at the paintings. He was a young man at the time when this event happened. So there's one early example of his work in the collection. And he basically read these paintings as documents. They spoke to him. He was like, oh yeah, this is Dalawongu clan, this is the artist, this is what the story is. Because, you know, these are his documents. This is, you know, the information technology of Yolngu. This is it, paintings, artworks. And here we are talking to Ishmael Marika. I don't think he's here. But, you know, we were going through this catalogue of the paintings and talking about them. And then he said, OK, we have to go and look at this Larrakitch because this is the contemporary expression of this clan lineage. So people aren't, you know, there's no disconnect. This is the continuity of culture that you can see through, you know, the historic works up till today. And of course, the big message we heard it the other day from Mulker as well was this importance of the relationships. So once you have, you can identify those clans through their artworks, hopefully through having the artist's name, you connect them in these ways to groups, large groups of other people. And it's these connections which are really important that we really need to map into the collections that we hold. So there's a big push to get collections up online. There's a big fancy push for digital collections getting out there. Some places are really set up for it. So Mulka has this really great setup where we can feed into them our database, and people can sort the artworks through the Gurutu and feed that back to us so that we're presenting things in the right way. But not everybody is that well set up. There's issues with internet connections, people not having computers, people not being computer literate or database literate, that kind of thing. So one of the things that we've found is that often sometimes the printed format is still very relevant in these communities. And also you need to keep going back to people. You can't expect you can do one tick box exercise of consultation. You need to, if you're going to have a relationship with people, you have to have a relationship that's ongoing, and it has to be built into our museum processes and archival processes. So I sort of end with a plea, which is about resources, like a budget line that is always there to do this kind of work, because otherwise it's only ARC driven, project driven. It's very hard for us to maintain those relationships. We want to, we just can't always do it. So main mark, respect, and we all need to keep working together into the future. Thanks.
Yes, yeah. I'm Zezek, curator at Museum Victoria, looking after working with Australian Aboriginal collections from Northern Australia, and Samantha Hamilton, who's my co-presenter here, did work at the museum until 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm now the Head of Collections and Exhibitions at the Arts Centre Melbourne, and just completing a PhD on conservation practices out in remote communities.
So Sam and I collaborated on a project with Jo in 2012, which we'll talk about here in a little bit of detail. But I'm also going to reflect on the sort of history of working with him over that time. As Aaron said, from 2000 was when Jo first came to the museum, and he came with Dr. Yolngu, the late Dr. Yolngu as well, to look at the men's material in the store. So that was my first encounter. This was a much earlier one. You weren't there the very first time they came. So Dr. Yolngu had been a number of times to the old site at the museum. But I believe that's the first time that I met Jo, when we'd not long opened at Melbourne Museum here in Carlton Gardens. So just to backtrack a little bit, I'd also like to acknowledge the people of the East Kulin Nation, the Wurundjeri clans, and acknowledge their elders, past and present. I also want to acknowledge other traditional owners in the room, and also my wawa here, Mongala, acknowledge your presence as well. And thank everybody for coming along. So in terms of this paper, we're sort of engaging mainly with the sort of brief of the whole sort of conference, with one particular point is to examine contemporary practice in the cultural sector and how we can go beyond consultation and engagement and question whether true diversity involves relinquishing authority, custodianship and control. I don't know if I come to any conclusions, but that's sort of the main thing I think that we're addressing. So as I mentioned, we had a project, and this is sort of the main sort of focus of our talk, are these two works here. And hopefully you'll already recognise that classic diamond pattern, Niwada and Birkudu, for the Dagogor clan in Eastern Arnhem Land. So these two paintings were collected by Donald Thompson in the 1930s. And from the outset, in terms of sort of, as you can see, this is before treatment. They were in fairly bad condition. Probably the only two paintings in the Donald Thompson collection that were really in quite poor condition. So in terms of sort of addressing this. Very early on, I said, after another project, I thought I'd tackle these and we'd have this sort of dialogue with Dagalgor about how we go about treating these. Do they need treatment? Don't they? What should that be? A whole lot of questions which Sam will go through in a little bit more detail in a while. So our challenge was to actually embed this sort of consultation, not just in the curatorial side of things, but absolutely embedded across all the sort of aspects of working in museums. So it's about curation of exhibitions, it's about curation of collections, it's about the management of collections, but it's also about the conservation of collections as well. So it's about using that sort of notion of collaboration in terms of sort of working with the people who have the responsibilities for these. So the project was undertaken a few years ago in 2012, and as I said, it involved the alignment of conservation practice with Indigenous knowledge, science and practice, and at the same time involved the detailed examination of these works and related documentation in order to establish their cultural and historical significance. We will discuss how the disparate parts of the record relating to these works were identified, and then how they were reconnected by Joe, and how we collaborated with him and his brother Mile, who we see here, in this research endeavour, and how this then provided the foundation for decision making about culturally appropriate treatments for the bark paintings. The application of multiple lenses to the interrogation of objects and the intersection of this Indigenous knowledge, science and the sensitivities with conservation science and practice, as well as critical analysis underpinning curatorial research, allowed for the historical noise to dissipate and the artificial layers to be peeled away, and thus allowing what were essentially hollow forms disassociated from their original context of creation and use to be reconnected with each other, so the objects with each other, but also more so to other parts of the documentation, but more importantly to events in the past and to people in the past, and then the connection of that to people in the present. And ultimately it allowed for, which was the end game, allowed for informed decision making to ensure the preservation of these works into the future in a culturally appropriate way. So I argue here for a dialogical approach in terms of sort of museum practice that brings together different cultural and disciplinary viewpoints and approaches when interrogating and researching Indigenous cultural patrimony in museum collections and private collections as well. This is not just the domain of people in public collections. It's proven to be an important tool in recovering the past and lends support to James Clifford's description of museums as places of hybrid possibility and political negotiation. Our aim with this project was to create an environment that allowed for Indigenous voice and authority to be foregrounded, while at the same time seeking to work together, all the time ensuring that the inherent power imbalance between the museum and the community was to be redressed in the process. This is what Peers and Brown describe as this new curatorial praxis that incorporates community needs and perspectives, and at the same time involves the sharing of skills, knowledge and power to produce something of power to all parties. We aim to demonstrate how applying different cultural and disciplinary frames of reference and methodologies can serve to maximise the potential to uncover and recover the past, to fill out these hollow forms and breathe new life into what might otherwise remain undocumented and undervalued cultural collections. With this, we seek to challenge the popular notions of museums as sites of friction, well, you know, it's just sort of bandied around a lot. Perhaps Howard Morphy's sort of sites of persuasion is a little bit more sort of what we're getting at, while at the same time not wanting to negate the harms felt as a consequence of the injustices of past practices and experiences. I know that map's come up sort of quite blurred. I'm not quite sure what happened in translation, but we're there in Arnhem Land. I'm sure everybody knows where it is, but I thought I'd put it in anyway. So these two bark paintings, as I mentioned, relate to the Dagalgor clan, and their ancestral homeland or clan estate is Jilaweri, which we were introduced this morning to in Aaron's talk, and that arrow sort of generally points to where the site is. It's on the western side of Buckingham Bay on the Arnhem Land mainland. So this is an image taken in 2002 by myself of Joe working sort of starting off his research at Museum Victoria, looking at the Donald Thompson collection. Now, this was the point that he embarked on his Gupapuyngu Legacy project. He had a formal name for it. Jessica's written about that a lot, and will no doubt sort of talk about that. This was his personal journey as a scholar and a Yolngu leader to recover the dispersed cultural elements relating to the Gumbula clan across museum and gallery collections and archives in Australia and overseas. We've heard about that from Louise today for the US. We would continue to work closely from that point in 2002 until his recent untimely death. Joe's primary focus at Museum Victoria, as I said, was the Donald Thompson collection in his earliest days. However, in time he would turn his attention to the other collections from Melbourne, connected to people like Reverend Webb, Bupper Wells, both superintendents at Melbourne Mission. Joe was also particularly focused on locating works, as we've heard, by his father, that was sort of one of his clear missions, who was an internationally renowned bark painter in the 1950s and 60s, and one of his quests in the Donald Thompson collection was to find a photograph of his father. And in fact, I'll come back to this image that's on the desk there on the bottom right. So there are a few bark paintings from the Gumbula clan, and we looked at all of these in the sort of earliest days, and you know, he did see these two older paintings and sort of noted that they lacked the sort of shine that they should have had, but wasn't particularly, you know, made any remarkable sort of statements about them. He didn't comment on who had painted them, but he did suggest that this one and another small one, which were less elaborate works than those other two, were most likely painted by Jawa's father, Nurich. So he was also searching for images of Nurich in Thompson's photos, not just Jawa. Initially, he couldn't locate any images of these men, and in particular he was looking for this shock of white hair that Jawa had, that you see in many of the photos of him as an older man. And I remember one day, after he'd been through all the 2,000 or so photographs, and then he just thought, oh, he's a young man. He wouldn't have had that white hair. So he went right back to the beginning and went right back through the photographs. So he readjusted his thinking and realised that he would have been about early 20s and, as I say, started this search again. And not only found extraordinary images of his father in ceremony, like this one here that we saw on the desk before, but yeah, this is painting up for a Nara ceremony, but an extraordinary sequence of 10 images that lacked any critical documentation. These took Joe's attention in re-looking at this visual archive. The discoveries of these would prove life-changing and would be a crucial element in the revision of his understandings of these two bark paintings many years later in need of conservation treatment. So I'm still talking about 2002. So the subject headings that these images were catalogued under was Arnhem Land, Jullumbull, mortuary practices. Beyond that, there were no names, no dates, no places. It was critical for Joe to put these images in the proper sequence, and he did that many times with Makarrata photo sequences and other things. And even when he talked in Louise's film, it was really critical for him to understand things in a chronological order. And it's this generational thing as well. So it's not just having an obsession with time, but it's, he wanted things in order that made sense, of course, within a sort of Yolngu framework. He knew who these men in the ceremony were. He knew where it was taking place and exactly what they were doing. And then at the same time, in his mind, he was having the sense of that place, the sense of the songs that were being sung by those men in those images, the dances, the sequences they were performed in. So it filled in this whole sort of visual, was filled in with all these other sort of senses and memories and images and sound. Now I'm going to show an image next, one of these images. It's actually breaking up the bones of a deceased person. So I just want to warn people about that. But what I've done is I've enlarged it so that you don't see those, but I just want to tell people that's the context of what you're seeing. So if anybody thinks they might be particularly disturbed by knowing that, please, I apologise or go outside. So here we have this image. So this is one of these 10 images of this Jullumbull. So in the centre here, or to the right, to the right, to the left, we have Norwich, who has the shock of white hair, not quite the sort of thick shock of white hair that Jawa has as an older man, but certainly he knew who it was. What Norwich is doing here is he's actually breaking up the bones of his father, Nua. The last of this family, this immediate line of men, to have had his bones broken up in this way and placed inside a dulpen, a hollow log, that was then subsequently raised on that site at Gillaweri and left to deteriorate. Joe realised that this was an actual event that he knew of. You know, it was a big event because it was the last time someone was buried in this way on country. A singularly important moment in history for the Daigul, and it was documented by Donald Thompson. It also meant, and it was important for Joe to know, that Thompson had been to Gillaweri. He didn't know that. He hadn't known that. So despite the other history of these images as part of a collection, disassociated from each other and from any other documentation, only Joe knew how to put this all together. Even, you know, we just didn't have the other documentation. I mean, quite an extraordinary situation. He carefully found these images, and then from that oral sort of history, been able to put together what was happening here, who these people were. He knew who the men were straight away once he sort of had his eye in, and what was going on. So he was elated to have found this treasure, which was of immeasurable importance to him and his immediate family. But he expressed disappointment at the same time, when he had this sort of elation, that his father had never told him that Donald Thompson had been to Gillaweri and documented this event. But he was also a bit cranky with Jawa that he'd never told him Donald Thompson photographed him. So there were all these other sort of emotions and responses. So here, of course, we have Jawa sitting next to Norwich, and of course Mongunu and Lipinja are also in this image. The three sons of Norwich. So consequently, these paintings, and particularly these photographs, have become a catalyst for a number of events well, not the paintings, but these photographs became the catalyst for a number of events that began with the return to Gillaweri of the family in 2004, and then again in 2005, that Aaron talked about this morning, but I'm not going to talk about that here. But at the same time, Joe requested that I take photographs with us to Gillaweri, and also a crate of objects from the Donald Thompson collection. Okay, Sam, over to you. Would you have this on? You've got one, yes.
So I'm also going to just pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land where we meet and to the wonderful elders that I had the opportunity to work with. We're going to move forward now to 2011, which was the first time I'd actually met Dr. Gumbula and had the opportunity to propose this project alongside with Lindy. That one. So I studied conservation in the year 2000, and from that moment I was very keen on understanding what the owners of collections actually thought about conservation treatment, because it's actually quite an interventive process, and I thought that was something that was always lacking. And I did look and had a fellowship overseas to the States and saw that there was different things happening in conservation labs. So this project was a fantastic opportunity to explore some of those concepts, thanks to Lindy's willingness as well. So we understood that we both understood that conservation of these particular bark paintings needed more than just a scientific approach. It was more than just a conservation approach to preserve their physical integrity. It needed an approach which would bridge the modern understanding of materials and techniques with ancient traditions and values. So historic bark paintings like these comprise of a bark support and a film layer. And that paint film has traditionally had very little binder, which is quite problematic when it comes to the preservation of them. So in summary, both of these bark paintings displayed common issues, such as planar distortion, which means that they get that kind of undulated surface. They were quite abraded because of that fragile surface of the paint surface. They had biological staining, so lots of evidence of mould and other activity. They had foreign accretions sort of caught in the paint layers. The paint was lifting, it was flaking, it was powdery, it was friable, and there was lots of loss. The bark support was delaminating, it was splintering, it was detaching, and there was lots of cracks and splits throughout. Without going, I could talk for quite some time, but I've really kind of tried to put this into a snapshot because explaining conservation treatment and the way we go about it is quite a long and technical process, but lots of thorough documentation takes place before you normally propose treatment, and lots of ethical considerations. So as a result, I devised a proposed kind of initially a treatment that was simply about stabilising the bark support, consolidating the paint layers, and then removing this bark painting DT46 from this support. So I'm not sure, was it in the 70s or something that we thought these sorts of supports were put onto bark paintings to kind of try and keep them flat? Lots of head nods and shakes. So obviously those clips cause lots of damage, and when you're trying to restrict something that naturally moves, it's quite problematic. So that was part of that initial proposal. And that, like I said, that proposal was built on understandings within conservation of materials and techniques and the ethics. And so those sorts of principles are based on reversibility, that whatever you do can be removed and it's reversed, that no cosmetic or restorative practices should be undertaken, that only minimal intervention should be applied, and that the introduction of materials and techniques should not at all alter the appearance of the paint layer or the support. However, there were a range of questions around the cultural context and the relationship between the tangible and intangible aspects that I had. For example, how did the community want these paintings to look? Should we treat them or just use preventive measures to care for them? Would treatment change or alter their cultural integrity or meaning? Were there any cultural implications as to who carried out the treatment? These were men's ceremonial body paintings, so I was concerned that I was a female conservator, and was that problematic? Perhaps it wasn't, but I was just interested to know. Was it important who handled the works, given that they were these clan designs? Was it appropriate to perform treatment that was quite interventive, or should it be just minimal? Should traditional owners be involved in any of that treatment, or should they directly supervise any of that? What sort of traditional care and repair techniques had been used in the past, and was it appropriate to use them now? What level of conservation treatment was acceptable? Did it matter if there were cracks? Should broken elements be adhered or flaking paint be consolidated? Were modern materials appropriate additions, or should research be performed to consider the use of traditional materials? Here's an image of the first meeting in Melbourne in 2011 where we just broached the conversation, and Joe was very interested. But from that initial meeting, it was clear that the Western concept of preservation and conservation treatment in a museum setting was foreign. Dr. Joe Gumbula expressed that he was part of a living culture that actively engaged with and painted these sacred designs, and went on to say that if these bark paintings were in poor condition in his community, they would be buried and new ones would be painted. So we're just going to show you a little bit of footage. What we then went on to do was develop a film around communicating these conservation principles and questions. Yeah. So what happened in that film was that I would ask questions and then Joe would translate them in Yolngu mata. But the footage that you're going to see here was just a summary of him kind of concluding what we were talking about.
Our Yolngu laws and Yolngu territories and Yolngu clan groups as a mala or clan group of people, things get old, and we get them, you bury them in the ground and that sort of thing. And of course, from the knowledge from the elder people keep sort of, passed on to the generation, and we do. If this would have been in my community today, we would actually done another painting like this. But here we are trying to, to try to contact with that, the content of, the works that would have been keep on going shined for, because so many years. So now, in the end, now we're talking about the losing of the paint and losing of some of the art. Some of the paperbacks are already sort of And it's not no time to stand it over again or use them as any other art bar paintings around this area. So now we're doing something that this have to be some ideas, because my work is in that, because I'm in the bloodline for my family creation, the ancestors has given to us that piece of, that's law. And where my brothers, because they're the most, artists in the community now, they would have to have access to this sort of work, but as because we are in the middle of, start to work this image, how we're going to set up for another 76 years, and this is long, nobody got the answer for that. Because if you're going to, play around with this, lots of times it will sort of not in that tension and look, very sort of perfectly. This was, only 20 years of age, but now we're looking at the times, it's so long now, and then, but I'm sure the story of this is because I'm a Yolngu. This is my group's painting, and my grandfather has given this to Don Thompson. Therefore, because the discussion was here earlier about these works and my family already knowing, looking at this video of us being to engage with this piece of work, and then we'll try and get to something, trying to achieve something out of this. Now we understand those two matters, two works that is involved in this area. But there's a lot of questions to be asked, like, because if you trace someone's finger or hand, what he has done, this one, that you are not doing, he's not doing it, it is you doing it. You're doing it now on the next level of paintings and all that. And that's a bit of a, hidden sort of language. But when you sort of, we don't take it from that, then we don't take it like that. Our law is, if somebody, we paint it again because it's still the same. It's nothing different. Long as it's another family members of the artist before.
It's a shame we're pushed for time, because it'd be good to explore some of the concepts that came up with this that are really crucial for conservation treatment. But Joe absolutely touched on copyright and intellectual property and artist moral rights, and repainting and all sorts of issues that are quite controversial really in conservation. So through those subsequent meetings and through those filmed conversations, we explored various options of conservation treatment, and one of those was repainting, as you heard. So Joe spoke about perhaps the community melee, somebody would repaint because especially the white clay was problematic. They were really quite concerned initially that the white was lost, and that was meant to shine. And so there was this whole conversation around how important it was to actually reinstate the white and make sure those paintings were had the integrity they were meant to. I'm just trying to summarise that quickly. Discussions also included the possible source of staining, and that was really quite unresolved. The use of that surface repair using the beeswax. I don't know if you noticed on one of them it had some beeswax on there, but that was confirmed to be original to the work. They also pointed out that whilst those designs and associated information were continued to be embedded in current practices and knowledge today, there was a great deal of historical importance to the people, and thus conservation treatment needed to happen to preserve these works. They did, however, express concern about conservation treatment, although it wouldn't be visible, that perhaps the paintings could be damaged or compromised through a cultural perspective. They spoke about the contentious issue of another person's hand not belonging to the family tracing over the original work. Even the cleaning of the surface, removing layers of dirt, could be problematic, as they understood that to be part of the life or the biography of the painting. So a visit to Milingibby, we'll just quickly say that, also allowed us to learn new knowledge. Lindy and I went out there to kind of broaden the dialogue and the conversations with various elders. We in return learned a great deal about the manufacture of bark paintings, including the harvesting and the use of the jalkirk, or the orchid juice, which was used to bind only the background paint layer, and that information was quite new, as it was common understanding that the binder was used with every paint layer. In that field trip, I also put together a presentation just so I could help the community understand more about conservation treatments in a museum setting. So I showed them things like this, where we use these sorts of brushes to remove dust, and how careful that process is not to remove paint off the surface. These were just some examples of how paint could be lost because of the minimal binding, and this is what it would look like. These are some of the techniques and the pieces of equipment that we'd use to consolidate that paint layer. This is called an ultrasonic mister, and you put the adhesive in and basically it sprays a fine mist. So in this sort of method, there isn't a direct interaction with the paint layer. It's through this piece of equipment. There's another localised method that I did show them as well, which is using a paintbrush and different types of adhesives. Again, it's unfortunate that we don't have enough time, because it'd be really interesting to explore those different adhesives and why certain decisions were made. I'm just going to be able to make a summary, show them images of what sorts of splits could look like, and then some repairs using sort of suture techniques that we use kind of in line with medical practices, how we care for bark paintings and how we travel and handle them. In the second meeting in Melbourne, this is where I did show them those techniques, so they could see the difference between what it would be like to consolidate locally with a paintbrush or to use the piece of equipment. Millet also brought materials down and showed us, again, the detailed manufacture of bark paintings. Let me just say quickly then, as the relationship developed and over time knowledge was exchanged and created through different meetings and demonstrations, which explored, as we said, both ways and both perspectives, they decided that they would not repaint the paintings, and they also decided that in fact I should be the person that performed the treatment, because we'd built this trust and they thought that I was the professional who had the right skills. So I followed their instructions, which, like I said, after lots of demonstration and conversation, they were very specific about the whole technique. So they said for me to only consolidate using this ultrasonic mister, and that I was to use a cellulose-based adhesive. Cellulose is the molecular structure of bark paintings, and so they were kind of matching that with the adhesive, and they were calling that bush medicine, which was really fabulous. They also approved those suture-type repairs, because they understood that the bark needed to move, and that these sorts of repairs would hold the pieces in place, but at least allow the bark to keep moving. And I'm going to leave it there.
Okay. So I'll just continue just very quickly now. Okay, so this is after treatment, as Sam explained. So really, to return to sort of my former story about these images, what was concluded when, Joe looked at the catalogue cards and we looked at the tags, the field tags, and what Donald Thompson had written, what was in field notes. I had to pull all that together for us in the context of this other conversation going on around what were the options in terms of sort of treatment. At the same time, they wanted to understand these works and build this knowledge and biographies of these objects. And what they told me was that they actually considered, while they'd been a little bit, as Sam said in the beginning, that this first reaction, not to say to bury those, but they said if these were in the community like this, we just would make new ones. But so the more we got into discussion of these, they then recognised that these were in the category of mingor, when you value something with high respect, when you want the paintings perfectly done, so they could see how these had been done, or reimagine how these had been done in the past, because of all the detail on them as well, that where the image is to shine, but as Sam said, the white clay it's the most friable, it's the last put on, and as Mila explained to us, it's the one you put on to really make it shine, to give it that power. But they said these old, even though the shine's not there, the old paintings that remain, they are the history. They agreed that these two works had been produced as part of that major event in those photographs that Joe put together. So these were made in the context of that Yolngu for breaking up Nua's bones. One of these had a date. I mean, again, these had sort of various documentation or not. One had actually said it had been collected in 1937, at Buckingham Bay. It made that connection. And for the other one, documentation was missing, but they agreed they were both made at the same time. They said the ceremony takes about a month, ends in cleansing with water and purification from Nara, and that given that Thompson had been there and he photographed them and he'd collected both of these from there, they had to all be part of that one story. And as Joe said to me, he said, the paintings together tell the story beyond the ceremony, while also being evidence of the story, that is that Yolngu at Jilawiri. Norwich was in his 70s by this time, and he was highly respected and had high power. It was the last moment to say to his sons, this is the way to paint these. This is about giving them law. They were young, in their 20s. So he asked me to get the photos out again, and we went through it all again and, you know, recognised other people in photographs and really went through all these sort of things. And then we were, and reaffirming that this was performing the final rites for this ancestor, Nua, which is also the name for the hill. And you talked about, it was talked about Noah this morning, this ancestor, but Nua is the name of Joe's great-grandfather. They concluded that Norwich painted this maybe with the assistance of his sons, so it might have been multiple people making this, and another man may have been involved, just sort of getting through quickly. Okay, so I'll just conclude now. So the importance of getting things right, you know, I think this is sort of that's come out of all our talks in working with Joe. It's about the importance of getting things right, of putting images back in order, putting things back in order, linking things together, putting them in the right sequence. In this sense, it was linking these to those photographs that he'd seen, you know, sort of a decade before, and then knowing that story themselves from family, from Jawa, and it all just, the physical evidence of these, their condition, all those things lent themselves very much to this sort of encounter. It was only serendipitous that we thought, okay, we'll look at these works. If I'd have never thought, let's have this project to look at these, I probably never would have got around to him reconsidering these. So it's also always very serendipitous how these things go. That's where I'll end.
Have some coffee.
And I just have to do the thing of acknowledging sponsors, but mainly I want to acknowledge my wawa and thank him for his generosity and mentorship. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.